Unfortunately, Donald Trump does fit the description of a leader of a real authoritarian bent who attempts to undermine some of the most critical safeguards of our democracy and our liberties and our freedom.
If we don't rein in presidential power, we could end up with a real dictator.
And what does Donald Trump then say? We are going to use these unleashed, uncontrolled troops, not against some foreign enemies, but against our own citizens in the cities.
We could see the violence and authoritarianism on the extreme left and the extreme right. The danger right now for the United States, the great danger appears to be coming from the extreme right.
Don't try to respond to Donald Trump's trampling on our freedoms and liberties by trying to seek revenge once you regain power.
Hello and welcome to Tracking Trump on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. It's been nearly 10 months since Donald Trump took oath as president for the second time. And increasingly, we are seeing a sort of a pattern in his presidency. Has he taken a more authoritarian turn, particularly over the last couple of months? If you look at the things that Trump has been doing, whether it's been calling out troops to police American cities, the way he's been using immigration authorities to go after illegal immigrants, the way that he is trying to defund democratic states and going after them financially. He's bullied universities. He's been bullying the media. He doesn't like a free press. He doesn't, like so many other leaders around the world who have a more authoritarian right-wing streak, he doesn't like a media that asks him difficult questions. And now he's actually using agencies like the Justice Department and the FBI to go after those he perceives as his opponents and his critics. He's even bullied law firms that at one time were litigants in cases against him in the past. And therefore, as the world watches what is unfolding in America, which has prided itself on being the world's oldest democracy, is Trump taking a turn for America for the worse? And can America survive 3 more years of this? What does this mean for American institutions, and what does it mean for democracies around the world that have often looked up to the US as an example in this area? Well, I have 2 distinguished guests with me today. Please let's welcome back Professor Allan Lichtman. He's a distinguished professor of history, an American historian and political analyst. He joins us from Washington. Thank you very much, Professor Lichtman, for being back on the show with us. Richard W. Painter is a law professor and former chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush administration in the mid-2000s. He's joining us from the state of Minnesota today. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Professor Lichtman, I wanted to start with you. When historians talk about authoritarian tendencies in leaders, what exactly do they mean? What are the characteristics that you're looking for? And does Donald Trump, according to you, fit that description?
Unfortunately, Donald Trump does fit the description of a leader of a real authoritarian bent who attempts to undermine some of the most critical safeguards of our democracy and our liberties and our freedom. Some of the hallmarks of authoritarianism historically are as follows: suppression of any dissent or any opposition, attempt to control education, communication, media, control what we think and what we believe, and an attempt to use the military domestically to clamp down on those with whom he disagrees. And because Donald Trump has such enormous power as president of the United States, he is exemplifying these tendencies. Let me just point to 2 things that are extremely recent. Number one, the joint conference between Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Trump and the senior military officers, where Hegseth says, we are going to unleash our troops. No restraints. They are going to be deadly. They are going to destroy things and they're going to kill people. And what does Donald Trump then say? We are going to use these unleashed, uncontrolled troops, not against some foreign enemies, but against our own citizens in the cities. Then he follows that up with something that's been entirely neglected. National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. You probably never heard of it. I call it Orwellian Memorandum 7. It got lost in the furor over the indictment of Comey and the declaration of Antifa as a terrorist organization. It is infinitely more significant because it is a directive to mobilize all of federal law enforcement against so-called triggers of violence and terrorism. And such triggers are catch-all phrases that encompass anything that Donald Trump finds disagreeable. Quote, anti-capitalism, quote, anti-Americanism, quote, anti-Christianity, quote, extremism on gender or race. In other words, he has criminalized and said he's going to use the force of the government, just as they come down on organized crime against individuals and groups with their free speech, violating these catch-all general categories, which include anything that Donald Trump doesn't like. Totally contrary to our most fundamental freedoms in the First Amendment, which establish freedom of press, petition, and speech, not to authorize speech according to the ruling party, but to encompass the broadest possible range of speech and dissent. This is something we've never seen before in America and is truly chilling.
I think you really summed it up very well. And Professor Painter, I mean, as someone who has served in a Republican White House, what is the shift that you see then in the Republican Party of today? Has Donald Trump, in a sense, completely ideologically taken over the Republican Party? Do you see murmurs of dissent even within the Republican camp on some of the things he's doing? I remember those there are leaders who spoke out, for instance, when Jimmy Kimmel was taken off the air, saying that this was wrong. But are those voices being heard at all?
Well, the Republican Party has fundamentally changed. That's been a process over many decades, but Donald Trump surely accelerated that process. And there are many of us who have a long history with the Republican Party who no longer identify with the Republican Party. Most prominently, of course, Liz Cheney, of Congresswoman, very, very conservative Congresswoman from Wyoming, who stood up to Donald Trump after the January 6th insurrection and paid the price for that in a primary. And she was thrown out of the House of Representatives and has been targeted by the extreme right ever since. And this was someone who was formerly an arch conservative member of the United States House of Representatives. So that's a serious problem for the Republican Party. To shift from a position in favor of states' rights and economic liberty toward a position of advocating for authoritarianism, which is what we're seeing under Donald Trump. Now, that being said, we've had a problem in the United States of steady growth of presidential power for over 100 years. I discussed this in a book that I have coming out this month with Cambridge University Press with my co-author Tom Sullivan, the recently retired president of the University of Vermont. And we talk about presidential power going back all throughout our nation's history. And we've had assertions of presidential power that were excessive, even in the John Adams administration with the Alien and Sedition Act. But Thomas Jefferson didn't enforce it, targeting aliens for their speech. People were not citizens, immigrants, and Donald Trump is reviving those portions of the Alien Sedition Act, which are still on the books. We've had a steady growth of presidential power, certainly since 1900. The gunboat diplomacy of Teddy Roosevelt. Now we're seeing President Trump going down and shooting down fishing boats off the coast of Venezuela. Of course, the internment of the Japanese during World War II by President Roosevelt, pursuant to executive order, what we went through in the Nixon era, illegal bombings of other countries, what Clinton did in Yugoslavia without the consent of Congress, without the consent of the United Nations. what we went through after 9/11. And I worked for President Bush, but I think there were some excesses clearly in the response to 9/11 and the use of presidential power there. But Donald Trump has accelerated all this by openly saying that there are no rules that bind the president of the United States. In effect, he can do anything he wants. And the Supreme Court of the United States in Trump versus the United States, unfortunately, has said that the president cannot be prosecuted criminally or official acts. There's a very strong presumption of immunity. And this is a very, very dangerous trend toward excessive presidential power in this country. And it's not just about Donald Trump. If we don't rein in presidential power, we could end up with a real dictator in the White House, and democracies have been turned into dictatorships by the head of state literally overnight, which is exactly what happened in Germany in 1933. We don't want it happening here.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important point that you make. I want to also say here that I mean, even in India, we have seen flashes of this happening over the last decade or so. For instance, the assault on the media, of which I'm a part. And, in light of that, Professor Lichtman, we've seen Trump's attacks on these various institutions, the courts. He doesn't like what a judge says, he attacks the judge. He doesn't like the media, he goes after them. He's attacking free speech, law firms, universities. My question is, are these institutions pushing back enough? Because you even have, for instance, an institution like Harvard that is now trying to negotiate a settlement with the Trump administration. Columbia tried to push back, but they had to settle with him as well. So is there enough of a pushback institutionally against what he's doing?
Very important question, and I will get to it in a moment. But I do want to follow up something that Professor Painter said. And I wrote about this in my new book, Conservative at the Core, A New History of American Conservatism. It just came out last month, University of Notre Dame Press, in which I point out that Trump is the culmination of trends, as Professor Painter indicated, that have been characteristic of part of conservatism for at least 100 years. Let's not forget, it was 100 years ago that we had prohibition put upon this nation. It was 70 some odd years ago that we had the McCarthy repressions of anyone on the left or anyone who was a non-heterosexual individual. So these trends, sadly, are not new, and Trump has now culminated and taken them to a new level. The other point is, apropos of your question, democracy is precious, but like all precious things, it can be destroyed. Throughout all of human history, democracy was incredibly rare. The first golden age of democracy was right after World War I, when you had about 24 democracies. That was cut more than half by the 1940s. Then you had the second golden age in the late 20th century. And the 21st century, as you point out, throughout the world has been one of declining democracy. Today, only a tiny percentage of the world's peoples live in a fully functioning democracy. And in the US, you're absolutely right. Critical institutions have not been really effective in pushing back against the authoritarian impulses of President Trump. I talked about one half of authoritarianism, the use of the military and law enforcement. The other half, as you point out, is controlling what we believe and what we think, going after premier educational institutions, law firms, the Smithsonian Institution, other cultural icons in America. And the problem is the president has enormous power and enormous control, things like grants and research, access. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage to challenge that. And I've been very sad to see such courage has been lacking. Some exceptions, like my alma mater, Harvard University. The other problem, why there hasn't been much more pushback, is the corporate control over our media. We don't have an independent media anymore. We have a corporate controlled media, which has tremendous conflicts of interest. They want all kinds of favors and benefits from the Trump administration, as we saw with the networks want to keep their licenses. They want to engage in mergers. And as a result, the mainstream media that was once, so bold and so strong, for example, in Watergate, has not been doing its job.
Well, I can tell you that sounds so, it's deja vu, because we've gone through the same turmoil, and unfortunately here too we've seen an institutional decline, whether it's the courts, the media, other independent institutions which haven't really fought back. But on this question of the escalation, in a sense, that Donald Trump has done against his critics and opponents, especially in recent weeks. Professor Painter, do you see Charlie Kirk's assassination, in a sense, as a turning point in this, where Trump is using that to escalate these attacks on his opponents and the far left, as he describes everyone he doesn't like? And in a sense, do dictators want a country to be at war with itself? Because then they capitalize on fear, don't they? That's how they rally their support.
Yes, and assassinations can be used as an opportunity to impose authoritarianism. And throughout the world, this has been a problem on the extreme right and the extreme left when they take control of governments. I mean, look at what's happening in Venezuela, what happened in Cuba, of course, the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninism that result in the murder of hundreds of millions of people. So we can see violence and authoritarianism on the extreme left and the extreme right. The danger right now for the United States, the great danger appears to be coming from the extreme right. Yes, there are a few people out there who think, gee, it was justified to assassinate Charlie Kirk or to kill the chief executive officer of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, last December. But those people are marginalized and really don't pose a threat. Obviously, if those people, as disgusting as they are, were to gain power in the United States, we would have a similar problem in the extreme left, but we don't. The problem right now is that Donald Trump is using political violence, which has come from the extreme left and the extreme right, as an excuse to impose authoritarianism. And that's not the answer. And I also think it's very important to distinguish between what Donald Trump is doing and traditional conservatism. I mean, I consider myself a conservative in that I believe in the principles of the founding of this country, including the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, which the founders cared so much about. And if you look at the history of the Constitution, it's quite clear the founders wanted Congress to be the preeminent power in Article 1 of the Constitution, and the Congress would oversee the executive branch, that the executive branch would implement the laws, not make the laws. It's very, very clear that what's going on right now has absolutely nothing to do with the intent of the framers of our Constitution. And as I said, we've seen abuses of presidential power from both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents since the turn of the 20th century, back in 1900, with the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba, and then down in South America, but through the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And as I said, once again, we had abuses under both Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, President Biden. So this is a bipartisan issue. It's not a conservative versus liberal issue. We need to constrain presidential power, but Donald Trump is taking it to a new and extremely dangerous level. And we need to bring this country together, liberals and conservatives. And I, as a conservative who believes in the founding principles of this country, I'm going to stand up against Donald Trump and for what we really believe in America. And this isn't it.
Again, you make a very important point about immense presidential power being at the heart of this, and that has sort of transcended administrations. Last couple of questions. Professor Lichtman, then hasn't Donald Trump, in a sense, with what he's doing, is he setting a new precedent every day? In other words, tomorrow, has America set in motion a cycle of retribution where whoever comes into power next, even if it's the Democrats, they could weaponize the FBI or the DOJ and go after their opponents because Trump did it. So you get into this vicious cycle of political retribution and vendetta, and that is a very dangerous precedent.
Couldn't agree with you more about
Are you
how
worried?
dangerous that is. And I would say to all my Democratic and liberal friends, and I have friends all over the political spectrum, don't do it. Don't fall into that trap. Don't try to respond to Donald Trump's trampling on our freedoms and liberties by trying to seek revenge once you regain power. In fact, do exactly the opposite. Try to restore the rule of law to this country. Try to restore respect for the First Amendment and our other constitutional freedoms. Rein in the power of the presidency. Respect the various branches of government and the division of power between the states and the federal government. Respect the rulings of the courts. In other words, restore us to the best of our democracy, not try to mimic the worst of Donald Trump. I cannot stress that too strongly.
Well, Professor Painter, last word to you. How is this playing out with the American public? If there's any insight you have at all, even Trump supporters, even amongst his MAGA base, free speech in particular is something that I know Americans hold so dear, as you said, the First Amendment. Has anything shifted at all? We know that his ratings aren't so great right now, but when you talk to people around you, do you sense any sort of alarm or concern about where this is going?
Yes, I think the American people are losing confidence in our president, including a lot of libertarians in particular. I and many others opposed the efforts of the far left to impose campus speech codes in our universities in the 1990s and early 2000s. And yet we have the Attorney General of the United States who wants to impose a campus speech code on our universities throughout the United States. I mean, there's a fundamental betrayal of First Amendment liberties, just one example. We have the suggestion that the President of the United States could ignore the orders of the United States Supreme Court being made by the Vice President, J.D. Vance, with support from some far right legal theorists. Now, I will say that it was suggested by a far left legal theorist, Samuel Moyn at Yale, and another co-author up at Harvard, that President Biden ignored the orders of the U.S. Supreme Court in the student loan case with a specious argument that this is okay on our Constitution, there's precedent for it. Well, there's not, and President Biden's lawyers never even considered that. And that's the difference, what's going on right now. Yes, there's an extreme left in our country, but they're marginalized. People aren't listening to them. The Biden administration lawyers never listened to such an argument that he could ignore the orders of the U.S. Supreme Court. But in the Republican Party, we've had more and more power being gained by the extreme legal theorists. The American equivalent of Carl Schmitt, the Nazi legal philosopher of the 1920s and 30s, who argued for more executive power and that all law is nothing but politics. Schmitt is still a darling of the critical legal theorists, yes, on the left. But the real dangerous thing is he's a darling of a lot of people now in the Trump administration, and unfortunately, I think in the Department of Justice. And this is the path to totalitarianism.
Absolutely, and that sounds pretty scary. And one wonders whether this will have an impact in next year's midterms at all, whether that will reflect some kind of a warning to the Republican Party. But we still have a long way to go, and so much could happen between now and then. Thank you very much, Professor Lichtman and Professor Painter, for joining us on this discussion today. It was wonderful to speak to you both. And that's it on the show this week. We'll be back with much more next week on Tracking Trump, including the latest on the India-US trade talks and what exactly is happening in that front. See you then.